just in the last hour, that's the first time I flew over this area and saw the oil sands operation myself, and it brought a lot of feelings, a lot of thoughts. Certainly, it brought me back to a time when I first got involved in politics on behalf of my own people. And I think a similar thing was happening in Haida Gwaii, where our forests were being clear cut. I remember elders referring to what's left as a sea of rotten stumps. All of our fish were being taken. Minerals were being similarly ripped out of the ground, and nobody was listening to us. There was no such thing as consultation or accommodation in those days. And then they were talking about drilling for oil and gas in our oceans. We're an ocean people. Our people live off the ocean. We eat the richest Haida prefers to eat fish from our waters, no matter what they can afford. That's just what our culture has bequeathed to us, and I'll never forget facing the challenges, many of which I heard your people working through this morning. I heard your elders talking over the last 2 days from the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. I heard your youth talking. You're facing many of the same challenges our people face. And I know what our people told. We were young leaders then, 30 years ago. And what they said to us is, it's been 100 and some odd years we've been trying to build a relationship with the governments of this country. We've been trying to get them to stand up and be who they say we are. A just people, a democratic people, people who respect the rule of law. We're telling them that they need to deal with this question of Aboriginal title, which they've never dealt with in Haida Gwaii, just as in your case you have Treaty 8. And they said, the issue facing us, they've taken most of our trees, most of our fish, our minerals. They are defacing our life source. They're defacing Haida Gwaii. And our survival as a people is at stake, they told us. They said every generation of our nation, for hundreds of generations, for thousands of years, has met one basic test. They've survived and they've passed our culture on to the next generation. They said once they come here and start drilling for oil and gas in our waters, I'm not sure we're going to make it, they told us. We have to do something different from just going talking to these people and having them with closed ears. And they said the reason we're Haida, the reason we're who we are, is not because of Ottawa and the provincial government and whatever little money they send us. The reason who we are is because of Haida Gwaii, because of our homelands, because of our life source. And you young leaders, what you need to do is to protect that. Don't worry about negotiating about money and all that. Protect that life source. That's how we're going to meet the test of our generation. And that became our mandate. We've been quite successful in doing that. Because we did one really key thing. We established a modern form of our government. Our title, just like your treaty rights, aren't held by me. They're not held by my neighbor in Haida Gwaii. They're held by all of us collectively. And we need to find a way to make decisions together strongly and to be able to stand behind them if we're going to be who we say we are if we're going to have strong relations with our neighbors, with other governments and our neighbors, with industry, we need to have a clear and definite and legitimate decision-making process. So in building that government, and our traditional government is still very strong. We have matrilineal descent. We trace our identities through our mother, and we have a system of clans with hereditary chiefs. The band council system pushed that aside for those 150 years, but our people decided we needed to, if we're going to be strong, we need to find a way of expressing who we are to ourselves, to our future generations, and to all our neighbors in today's terms. So how we turn that collective title, that collective identity into that legitimate decision-making process is we wrote a modern constitution. We took our really still strong oral traditions, our hereditary system, and we framed it in a democratic process. But still, our traditional hereditary system was recognized and brought legitimacy to our modern form of government. And we authorized from that our core governance we clarified our vision as a nation. That and we clarified in that vision our values and principles that bound us together. And we wrote that in a constitution. Anybody can go online and read that constitution today. It's still very much a work in progress, as is any nation's constitution. But it was a critical factor in having us regain control over the lands and oceans of Haida Gwaii, of our territory. And I'm happy to report that today, some 30 years later, the lands of Haida Gwaii are in a land use plan that was initiated by our people. Our people were concerned with logging, but also our economy was based on logging. A lot of our people were loggers. So we went out there and we drew on a map of our islands. Here's where you'll continue to log. These are forest lands. We also drew areas that were to be protected. We figure we need portions of our islands that are in their natural state forever for us to remain Haida. And we delineated those areas. And we said, these are the rules where you log, these are how you're going to log, ecosystem-based management principles. We didn't negotiate about the protected areas. We said, these are our islands. We are the people of the Haida Nation. And if we say there's no industrial activity in these areas, there will be none. If you try, you're going to face us. And we legislated those protections and those definitions through the institutions of government we set up in our Constitution. And, legislation, which is essentially the legal authority of your people being applied, doesn't have to be complicated. The first piece of legislation that we passed in terms of land use was to create a beautiful area on the west coast of our island that we named Dugoose Tribal Park. They were threatening to log it, and we said, no, it's going to be protected. So we named it, we drew a line around it, and our legislation was like one sentence. It said, Dugoose Tribal Park will remain in its natural state in perpetuity. That was our law, that was our legislation. And every agreement we did with any people who came in there was crystal clear what the Haida view was about their lands. And if they wanted to deal with us, this was the starting point. Similarly, and I'm also happy to report, everybody respected that. The logging companies, it's been legislated by the provincial government now. The next one was Guayhanas, many of you know as South Moresby. That was a little more complicated. They decided to fight us, so we ended up in blockades and courts. Many Canadians came to our aid, but still, legislation was the same. In 1985, we passed that legislation. Guayhanas, we drew a line in the map around it, will remain in its natural state in perpetuity. Canada bought the Crown rights off the province and negotiated the first nation-to-nation deal with the Haida Nation. An agreement that still exists, persists today. The only thing we're waiting to do is fully reconcile where they're going to turn jurisdiction over to the Haida Nation fully. So that governance, however you define your government, whether you want to remain with your ancient system, which has worked for you up till now, or you want to interpret that in a modern constitution and write it out so anybody can see. One of the advantages of a written constitution is whenever an industry wants to come into our lands, they don't have to guess what it's going to take to get our consent. All they have to do is read our constitution and see that if there's any legislation that the Haida Nation has passed in relation to that area. And they know one thing: these are the rules that the owners of these islands have laid out. And they also know another thing, that no Haida leader is ever going to make an agreement against that constitution and legislation, or they're not going to be a leader for long. And they also know that there's no discussing it. All there is implementing it. And that's by the will of your people. You know, I heard the elder get up this morning and talk about, let's quit reacting to the Indian affairs and the federal crown. We have an agreement with the Queen. We have our treaty, which has understandings in it. However you clarify your view of that is your business, but I think it's going to really help relations. It's going to give governments, other governments, and industry an opportunity to understand you as they recognize you. And it's going to give them an opportunity to relate to you in a respectful way. If they understand how you see the world, how you see your territories, and how you see acceptable behavior in your territory. So that's why governance is such a key step, a key element of building strong relations with other governments and especially with industry. And I know in my history of not only being a Haida leader, but facilitating treaty negotiations in British Columbia as chief commissioner. You know, when it comes right down to it, governments don't have any problem with First Nations asserting sovereignty, with First Nations implementing their own jurisdiction. Industry needs one thing to operate. They need certainty. They need to know what the rules are. It doesn't matter who makes them. They need to know what the rules are and sit down and figure out a way to make those businesses work. I mean, these fellas can speak to that. That's been my experience. And if you get clarity by First Nations asserting it, there's nothing wrong with that. And one thing that happens pretty quick is if that's the case, the governments find a way to reconcile. And if we're going to make our legal system work, which has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting lately, us standing up and asserting our rightful jurisdictions, as John Olthius so eloquently laid out yesterday. You know, First Nations exercising jurisdictions at the same level, not inferior, not superior, but at the same level as the federal and provincial governments is nothing new. Maybe Bob Ray will talk to us a bit about that. He was a key architect of Charlottetown, where Canada was on the verge of accepting that principle. We can breathe life into it by our actions, building good governance. So I'll look forward to any questions, any discussion on that. I know that's a pretty broad brush sketch of that, but I think it's a really important concept. And the reason Athabasca Chippewan First Nation is here is because you, generation after generation, has trusted your culture and ensured good governance in running affairs on your territory. There's no reason it can't be done today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Miles. We just have time for 2 short questions, so.
Is that on? My question is more for Mr. Carter. Being the CEO, the previous CEO of Syncrude Canada, and having a wealth of knowledge of the oil and gas industry, when we look at economic development for Aboriginal people, ACFN in the local area, if we were to pull out a report card, you'd probably get a B, a passing grade. But from a CEO's point of view, I would like you to answer 2 questions. One is having the ability to forecast future developments. What just a second, gather my thought here. If you were to sorry, but I just drew a blank here. If you were to have the ability to forecast development from a CEO and a decision maker, what must industry do to improve the report card for the environment and the pace that development's taking place? With your knowledge, what must a person in that caliber do to address the issues of the local First Nations when it comes to the environment and the pace of development?
Okay, just to clarify, I was actually the COO of Syncrude, but obviously President and COO, so very much at the top of the organization. It's a very good, interesting question that you're asking, because there are many factors that go into determining what will drive the future development, which include economic issues, include market access issues. I mean, there's no point in growing the business if we're going to produce a product that we can't get to market. And it also concerns issues like availability of capital and being able to give shareholders, an adequate return so that they will, in fact, want to invest in the business. And by the way, that wasn't always the case for the oil sands. We toiled away in obscurity for the first 15 to 20 years in this business, just trying to prove to the world that we could actually do it. And we couldn't get capital investment until the mid-90s when the government of Canada, then under Prime Minister John Chrétien, and the government of Alberta under Ralph Klein actually arrived at a set of level playing field fiscal terms that enabled it to go forward. But when it comes to things like the environment, every time an investment has been made, the latest state-of-the-art technology has been employed. And I could, cite you many examples over the years that we did, the way we did it at Syncrude. And for example, when we went away from the dragline bucket wheel operation to trucks and shovels, we invented a way of mixing the oil sand with water and transporting it by pipeline into the plant. That reduced our energy for transportation by 13%. But what it really helped further in was that we were able to get the bitumen to free itself from the sand in the transportation process. We were able to reduce the temperature from 80 degrees down to 45 degrees. So that meant our energy inputs and that CO2 emission per barrel thing that I talked about earlier, that drop of 30%, came as a result of that technology. So we made those investments for the whole operation when we had a chance to expand. We did the same when we built the upgrader expansion 1. We put in, we used to send, at one point when we were making 200,000 barrels a day, we'd be putting 275 tons a day of SO2 up the main stack. Sulfur dioxide, which, is not arguably a good thing. When we did UE1, we put in a ammonium sulfate fertilizer process where we took a stream of ammonia and passed it over the SO2 and made ammonium sulfate fertilizer. Today, Syncrude is one of the largest producers of ammonium sulfate fertilizer in Canada. So that goes into the fertilizer market today, and it doesn't go up the stack. Today, Syncrude probably puts up less than 100 tons and makes 300,000+ barrels a day. So the point is that you try to implement new technologies as they're being developed when you have those opportunities going forward. And the same thing when you look at water consumption. One thing that's not well understood is that Syncrude, the existing oil sand players, do not discharge process-affected water into the Athabasca River. And they've learned how to consume less water. The water is recycled 18 times. So there's less than 2 barrels of water per barrel of oil now that's produced in the oil sands. In the early days, it was much higher than that. So, and that's been the saving grace of the oil sands, by the way. It's been all about science and technology. If we hadn't been smart about doing that, as I said earlier, it would be just dirt in the ground. It wouldn't be ore that we could actually mine and do it at profit. So it's always been an industry of developing technology and advancing engineering and science. And the developers have invested in that technology, and as time goes forward, they will continue to do that, and we will see improvements in the way that the material is processed. And you will see a reduced carbon footprint. So it's a long-winded answer. I hope I got to your question, at least partially.
Thanks, Jim. Are there any other questions?
I guess this question is for Guy Boudelier. I guess given the amount of bills that were passed in regards to the oil industry, do you think it's possible for Canada to nationalize the oil industry where it will benefit the people and the environment?
Thank you for your question. And the short answer is, in striking that balance that you speak of, is it's always going to take an effort by everyone. And by everyone together with the proper rules and regulations that perhaps need to be enhanced through the understanding of what's taking place here. The example I use is when Chief Allen yesterday talked about he was first listening to his elders. And I think governments need to do a better job in listening. And it's easy for me to say that now as a private citizen, but listening, learning, and then taking action. And I'm very proud of the relationship that I had built with so many people and so many stakeholders, but it included everyone, our First Nation, our Métis, as well as industry. And so as we go forward, can we strike that right balance? We can only do it by all of us working together. And the people in the room here, I do know that in order for it to achieve, I would like to see more industry here today. I would like to see more government people here today working with us to strike that balance that you speak of. And I hope at the end of the day for our families, my 6-year-old son will breathe the water. You don't breathe water, but unless he's a really good scuba diver, to strike that balance by working to ensure our families are protected so that 200 years from now, we're still able to sustain it and do it, as the chief and Archbishop Dismond did say yesterday, Tutu. Thank you. I hope that answers part of your question. Thank you.
Hi, Guy, you may as well stay standing. This is directed at you as well.
Okay.
Do you remember Olivia Appa?
I certainly do, where she lived up in Abysan, where you and I both visited her in her dying days.
Absolutely. Now, for hello? Hi. Sorry, for people that don't know, Olivia Appa was a Ghanaian lady who lived in Fort McMurray. About 17 years ago, she became a patient of mine when I practiced here. She had breast cancer, and she was very sick, in fact, terminally ill. So she requested permission for her niece in Togo, who was a teacher, to visit her here in her dying days. She wanted to go over for 2 weeks. Olivia had 2 teenage daughters. She was divorced. The government inexplicably refused admission for this lady, saying that she was at too high a risk to want to stay in Canada, despite the fact that the niece had produced evidence of her having a job to go home to and stating clearly, I do not want to stay. My home is in Togo, as it was then. So anyway, Olivia told us about it at the office, and so we tried to advocate for her. This is all about advocacy. Sorry, I'm being a bit long-winded, but I'll give you the background then of a question for Guy. We made some phone calls, got a negative response. We spoke to local people, spoke to Guy probably first, and the local media got hold of it. The Edmonton media got hold of it, and I believe the Globe and Mail was involved. And still the patient herself got repeated negative responses, and she was getting weaker and weaker. She did not have long to live. So we set up a petition out of our office down at Plaza 2 and sent it everywhere. Other doctors' offices, pharmacies took it on. The petition went to Edmonton. It ended up on the streets in Halifax. We had thousands and thousands of names of people calling on Lucien Robillard, who was then the Minister of Immigration, and Chrétien to please allow this lady to come into the country. No, 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 we heard again and again and again. At the time, David Kilgore was the Speaker of the House in Ottawa. He was from Calgary, and he, among other federal representatives, came on board and said, I'm with you. So we said, and Guy was involved, we said, we are going to go to Ottawa with boxes of names if we don't get Chrétien and Robillard to change their minds. It was on a Friday. We walked into the office on Monday morning. There was a fax in from the Federal Immigration Department saying permission granted. Yeah. It was the power of advocacy. I just want a yes or no, if you can, Guy, for this. If, based on the fact that we've had irrefutable, respected scientific reports indicating, contrary to what the government and industry have been saying, there is an impact, an adverse impact on the environment for this massive devastation that's going on north of here. We have the Cancer Board in Alberta saying there are higher rates of cancer. We have Jim Talbot, the provincial medical officer of health, saying, yes, there are 3 cancer clusters in Fort Chip. Promises of health studies in Fort Chip and Fort Mackay that have been broken. Would you be willing to support a petition, like a community-based effort to actually have government be accountable and responsible? Would you be willing to stand by that?
Yes, I would, John, and even furthermore to that, the question you ask, I obviously was reading what the Ministry of Health had said regarding cancer patients, and Olivia was an example, and many others that we know. My mom passed away from cancer, and I will say this, that I applaud the fact that regardless of what the government has done, the people here and people have said, we're going to do this and we're going to get to the bottom of this. And that advocacy, in my view, I never really ever believe an expert, because the same experts are the same people who said asbestos never had any impact on her health. And I share with you that example because our son is 6 years old and he's on the autism spectrum. And I still attribute it back to the fact that when he got his vaccination, that it had a role to play. He had more words then than he does today. And so when I hear the word expert, I think the word expert sometimes is a loosely held word. And so, John, I think it's no surprise to you that, and I thank you for the role when you brought that to my attention with Olivia 17 years ago. And I must admit, it was a really good fight, and we got the result we were looking for, and her family. And I seriously thank you as her doctor who was helping her, because that's the kind of advocacy and what you're suggesting we need to continue to advocate for. Because each of us as one voice truly are a voice that I believe in our today's society can make a difference in changing what government is doing or not doing as we go forward. And I thank you for pointing out about Olivia and her family coming together. It was somewhat of a pleasant ending.
So let's do it again.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much,
Thank
Guy.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to each of our speakers. We're going to have a short 10-minute break, and then we'll return with the Honorable Bob Ray.